Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Welcome back, hopefully, to the channel. In this video, I would like to talk about something that has been implicit in many other videos, but we've never really made it explicit. And so I would like to leverage some of the literature in neuroscience and psychology, but keep it connected to sort of the more philosophical psychoanalytic stuff we've been talking about regarding the narrative body. I'll go and introduce that briefly in the beginning of this video. And then I would like to focus on how identity shapes or the ego essentially shapes cognition. So how does, we've been talking about this sort of the core role of this narrative body moving through the world. The question is why? Like what happens in concrete? And I'd like to sort of split this talk into three sections. The first section is a brief recap for all those that are new to the stuff that we've been discussing in the past few videos over the past months and weeks. And so that is, I want to give a brief introduction of the perspective we have on the ego and identity and introduce the concept of the narrative body. And then in the second part, I want to go over a chapter I've written a while ago, which is entitled How Identity Shapes Cognition. And so this is essentially about how our identity, or the ego, as we will speak about it or have spoken about it, the narrative body shapes the way we perceive the world, and then sort of how novelties interact with. So that would be sort of part 1.1, if you will. And then part 2 is an example, more concrete example, that is an example from language, and sort of how that can, in the work of Paul Ricoeur and others, and how language or metaphors in language in specific influence, map one-on-one on how we act. So, and those are two slightly different yet related topics. So one is, we say, right, my personal or personal views, personal attitudes highlight certain effects. Highlighting effects on the external world, and the other is, okay, there are non-personal elements that I personalize that affect how I interact, how I act and interact with the world. And I would like to just sort of, so there is a distinction here, right? But then I'd like to break down the distinction and say it doesn't really matter, because as we've discussed, and this leads us right into the first part. So what we've discussed is the ego can essentially be viewed as a conglomerate or a network of elements that are autonomous, so they don't belong to me, or they don't belong to the subject that holds them in their network. The elements are autonomous or semi-autonomous. They're autonomous insofar as I don't control their ultimate meaning, but I acquired them, so to speak, at some point in time when I was interacting with someone that installed this element into the linearity, or into the story that I build around myself, so into this narrative body. That's the hypothesis that we're going with. And again, like, this is all hypothetical, of course, and there is a body of literature supporting this, but I think the term narrative body is not really present in literature beyond me. And so these elements are autonomous insofar as their ultimate judgment, and I refer to this as negative judgment. If there's a challenge, like I have a certain view of something, and then someone challenges this view, and this someone either has, I talk about this in the video on the trauma that I did, and that other person has a sort of for the challenge to have a big effect, that other person either has authority, must have some kind of authority. It's either they have subjectively perceived authority, either over the topic or over myself in general, or they're actually connected to the element, to the moment the element was installed. So here's how we could visualize it, right? You have two lines, right? I can show this graph, maybe you can work it into the video. But you have two lines, and you essentially, in a moment, you have a positive, I call it positive judgment, where someone installs, this is the bottom line is your own, the linearity of your own identity, so your own narrative. And someone comes and installs something into that narrative, that's in that moment is perceived as neutral because you don't have anything associated with this specific variable. Let's say, you know, for example, like and this usually happens in childhood, but it can happen in adulthood, but someone introduces you to a new sport, let's say, and you had no connection to this sport or no emotional connection to any other sport, and someone introduces, let's say, I don't know, football or tennis or something to you, and you start interacting with it, and you really like it, and that person will always remain the one that introduced it to you, and maybe they say you're good at it as well, or you would be good at it, and they sort of they play, as we say, they play on your ego there, and so the point is that from now on, excuse me, from now on you have this linearity going on towards the future, right? Excuse me. But at the same time, the other person, you're still connected to the other person because they develop in relation to that element, they also develop in a linearity going in the same direction just for sake of visualization. And this happens thousandfold, right? Like that person is connected to another person, and so on and so on. So we're caught up in this infinite web of debt, as I say, I refer to it as that we're indebted with regards to these elements to others. And so now the point is that if the other person changes their opinion or deviates from what they've installed originally, then you encounter, and then it doesn't matter in the first place, right? In the first place, it doesn't matter. But the element, so the element itself, the element playing football related to the variable playing sports, for example, that is, it's used and accessed millionfold, and all these stakeholders have somehow played with the element. So that's why I say it's autonomous, right? But with regards to you, it's owned by you and this other person, maybe a couple other people over time, touch upon it and so on. But the point that what happens is, if this other person develops this element further for themselves in their own linearity, maybe because someone else introduced something new to them or whatever, it doesn't matter so much to you because you're independent of that, right, ultimately. But as soon as the person returns to you and somehow says, oh, actually, I thought about it, you're not good at football, let's say, for example. But at that point, you're really identified with the element, right? That'll be a traumatizing experience. You'll be experiencing we call, I call it negative judgment, and it'll cause a rupture. So okay, that's essentially the start of it. And so the question that we want to explore is how this form of ego structure shapes cognition, right? And we know that single exposure has great effects on our own way, on our own behavior. Like we know that, for example, rats can have an aversion to drinking certain colored water. The experiment was done with colored water after single exposure. So we know disgust has a certain plays a role in here, but it's the fear circuitries essentially, because the water in these experiments, the water was essentially colored and then electrified. So whenever they would drink from it, they get an electric shock. And after one exposure, they wouldn't drink. So one electric shock, they wouldn't drink the water with the same color, right? But so we also know that you have the kangaroo whale illusion, or the duck. I don't know what the other one is, like duck rabbit illusion, right? Where you have a certain we have a lot of optical illusions like that. You can Google them. It's very interesting, and it depending on your cultural background, you'll perceive an image, the same image, either as a rabbit or as a duck, right? It's very interesting, and once you saw the other, you can't really unsee it. But it's very interesting, and so. But you see in that context, like, and when you go in and you're like, oh, rabbit, right? This is a rabbit. You'll see a rabbit, right? And when you go in and say, oh, this is a duck, you'll see a duck. So this shows you in a way like how the brain works, and it's an interesting point regarding synchronistic experiences, or the perception of them, because where you have essentially where you essentially have the situation where we think, oh, with synchronistic experience, oh, that's an intervention, right? I keep saying that as well. Like synchronistic experience act as objective interventions. You can't escape their sort of, you can't interpret them, or you can't subjugate them by way of interpretation. But now the point is, we all know this. It's like, oh, lately I've had all these encounters with topics that pertain to lamps or to plants or something. I should get a plant, Or everywhere I read about this new thinker, like person, blah blah blah. I should read their book. But it's like, okay, well, first of all, Google algorithms. But second, is this a sort of a spotlight effect where it probably has a name, I forgot, but it's I'm sure it's an effect where it's like, spotlight effect is different, but it certainly has an effect. I'm not sure. Put it in the comments if you know. But that effect is it's essentially like, because you've been thinking about it, you've been seeing it everywhere. It's like when you think about mothers with strollers, and that's like, I remember, like I was before we had our first child, it was like we never saw anyone with a stroller anywhere, and as soon as we had to buy strollers suddenly were everywhere. It's like everyone has a child in a stroller suddenly, right? And so that's really that's the whole. But it's like the number of people having a stroller doesn't change. So it's the change was in your head essentially. And so there are these cases. This is also memory implementation, false memory implementation, which is quite known, right? We know that there's no, like, memory is very it's very, very bad, right? So essentially, maybe the supermarket, the mall, sort of the mall memory, where they had it, if I remember this correctly, they told a child or there were an adolescent, a student, told them, oh yeah, do you remember this one time you were lost in a mall and a man XYZ dressed as Santa Claus came up to you and sort of saved you and brought you back to your mom? Like, do you remember that? They were like, oh yeah, of course I remember that. And it never happened. Like, it never happened. But it was just because, yeah, your mother, like, they did it in the assessment, like in the initial sort of assessment phase. Well, yeah, we just want to ask you a couple of biographical questions and confirm with you. Like, we talked to your parents, to your family as well. It's very important we get those details straight. It was like, oh yeah, this in the mall and so on. And it has to be specific to your cultural context. Like, you tell that to me, I'd be like, a mall? I've never been to a mall with my parents. Like, that never happened. We don't have malls here, like, not really big malls. So this is interesting to note as well. An interesting memory effect. And then you have. Then we have the metaphors, the problem of metaphors. So I was just reading through my notes and to see if there's anything more relevant. But we have the issue of metaphors, right? Where we have, for example, the saying, like, we have metaphors on the level of I don't know, whatever. But it's these metaphors. It'll be metaphors that are ingrained in our language. So it'll be something like, this is recursive work, Lakoff and Johnson. Sorry. 1980 book, 1980s book. And so we conceptualize an argument as a war, right? So we'll go and say things like, argument is war, or we'll go like, your claims are indefensible, or they attacked every weak point in my argument. Her criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. If he uses this strategy, he will wipe him out. Like, stuff like that. He shut down all my arguments. Like, we talk like this, and it sets up, and this is the whole point, it sets up a very specific cultural context. Like, it sets up a very specific way we act. And it's actually detrimental. Like, I think one of the most important things we can learn from psychoanalysis or psychology in general is that what we say literally defines what we are. And this is so mainstream. I feel really bad about saying that, but it's true. I mean, for anyone who benefited from this statement, you're welcome. But I think this is it's stupidly simple, but it's very true. Like, if you always say, oh, I feel so tired. I feel so like worn out. It's such a bad day. Like, you know what? I don't like this. I don't know. Look outside. I don't like me. Like, you'll literally, that's what's gonna happen. Like, and it's self-fulfilling prophecies often as well, where you're like, like, oh, surely today I'm gonna meet with my mother, and surely today she will be annoying again, whatever. And so what will happen? Like, you'll go in with a bad attitude, and she'll be annoying, right? And you'll perceive her as annoying. I think that's the most important point. You'll perceive her as annoying, but you'll also have you know you also make her be annoying, right? You'll annoy her, and so she'll be annoying, right? Essentially. So what Bronner's work, 2001 work, on narrative identity essentially suggests that these metaphors not only these metaphors shape people's behavior, but also the sort of the culturally canonical narratives, right, or accounts shape our identity. And I add to that it's not necessarily like we live by mimesis, essentially. Like, we reenact stuff that we see. It's literally, that's what we base behavior on. The mirror neuron system is literally that we reenact. Like, if you laugh to a baby, they'll smile back. If you're grumpy, your baby will be grumpy. It's a very, Jung says that essentially the baby's personality, so the baby's psyche and the parent's psyche is not separate. So it's the same. If the mom is sort of timid and nervous, so will the baby be, right? So it's always the same. But so the point is that what happens here, or what we seek for, is, I said this in the trauma video a while back, is that we seek to generate templates for behavior, right? Like, if I grab this bottle, but I'm gonna have a drink of it. I do it not as an empty slate, but I do it with something that is with movements that I already know. And if I have never grabbed the bottle, or if the bottle looks different from other bottles, I apply that framework to this bottle. This is work done also by what's her name? It's in here somehow. Let me find it. Patricia Churchland. So the point here she makes is that she tries to map this onto the neural network. So she says, okay, you have units in the neural network, so that's your synapses, right? Or yeah, I guess. And so there's connections, and the strength of these connections, so the weights of the units that are sort of calculated within a calculation unit of the brain, that decides how you'll act. And so it's not one single unit that makes up the behavior, but it's always, is this more of a bottle, or is this more of a blow dryer, or a piece of trash, or a pen, or a mouse? Like, what does this look like? It looks, let's say, 70% like a bottle. Could be an oil can, right? An oil container, I don't know, oil gallon, I don't know if that's a word, and it could be something else, I don't know, but it's most likely a bottle. It has characteristics, and so that's why I'll treat it as a bottle. And so with this predictive processing, we'll go into the world and sort of tend to understand everything. And so these metaphors and these narrative structures play an important role. And here cultural narratives come in, canonical narratives, and drive sort of the way that we interact with things, and how we act them out, and so on. And so I think that's very important to sort of have that in mind, right? And so that's what I wanted to bring and share. And I hope that was helpful. I think it helps thinking through these other layers or other perspectives to understand. Sorry, the call was this was a bit of a week on the literature side. If you're interested in me making a more in-depth literature review of this, I'm happy to do so. Let me know in the comments. But I think it gives a brief introduction to how identity shapes our interaction with the world and our perception of it. And so, again, if you have questions, if you have comments or remarks, or want to know more, please do so. Write them in the comments. And thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.